Is the era of the United States being the dominant global power over? Donald Trump, Marco Rubio, Pete Hegseth all have done a lot to weaken our country, degrade our global alliances, and foolishly expend our wealth on foreign adventures. And the answer to this question may surprise you. Welcome back to Meidas Defense. I'm your host, Joe Plenzler. Today we're breaking down a conversation that cuts straight past standard Washington talking points in foreign policy. For the last 25 years, the United States has operated under a dangerous illusion born at the end of the Cold War. The belief that the American military is absolute and that we have the luxury to chase every shiny object around the globe without ever setting concrete strategic priorities. But as our national debt reaches $39 trillion and families feel the crushing economic weight of overseas interventions right at the grocery store and at the gas pump, that illusion is shattering. I sat down with National Security Advisor Chris Preble, Senior Fellow at the Stimson Center and a U.S. Navy veteran, to look at the global landscape. I started by asking Chris what he sees when he looks at our current national security posture and what our priorities actually should be. Here's Chris.
Well, I think our priority, first and foremost, is that we should have some priorities. And I've written a lot about this over the years, right? I mean, I think there was certainly a time coming out of the Cold War, when this is when I was in the Navy, we were coming out of the Cold War. We're like, what the hell are we going to do? We had this Cold War military and then no more Cold War adversary. And it was easy in the 90s to muck around and fight these little wars and not bump up against anybody. Or if you did, it was sort of, negligible. You sort of brushed them aside. And, so it was I understand why we imagine we didn't really have to set priorities. But I mean, the last 25 years have just been one thing after the next, where we're reminded about both our domestic constraints, internal constraints, everything from the budget to the public sentiment and public will. That's a constraint on U.S. actions abroad, to other countries. We bump up against other countries. And lo and behold, again, we learned in Iraq, we learned in Afghanistan that even very weak, adversaries, if they have determination and will, can really make life miserable for the U.S. military. And, again, fortunately for the American people, these wars are far away. So aside from those individuals who have family or who serve themselves, those wars are kind of, they're over there. They're not really affecting their lives very much. And a lot of people can sort of bump along and they'll do just fine, right? But now we're involved in a war against another adversary that the president says he's defeated decisively. Yep. And the effects are being felt here in the United States. I mean, we're feeling this every single day. You pay it at the pump, you see it in the price of, food, whatever. So I think we're in a different world. And so we have to set priorities. We cannot just roam around sort of chasing after every shiny object, and be very, very clear about what our core interests are and how we go about defending them.
Chasing shiny objects. It sounds simple, but the tactical reality of doing that in 2026 is mathematically unsustainable. For decades, the defense establishment has been single-mindedly obsessed with an Iranian nuclear weapon. But as Chris points out, the regime in Tehran realized they don't even need a nuclear weapon to hold the West hostage. They just need regional asymmetric levers, specifically tactical control over global shipping in lanes like the Strait of Hormuz. Listen to how Chris breaks down the absolute mismatch between American spending and the reality of modern decentralized warfare.
The Iranians have discovered something more powerful than a nuclear weapon.
For sure.
They don't need a nuclear weapon. They have control of the Strait of Hormuz. And unlike a nuclear weapon, which you cannot use actually, like brandishing a nuclear weapon is hard. No one really believes you when you say, I'm going to nuke you, right? Well, they can use the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. They have used the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. And I think, to hear the president talk about Iran's Navy is on the bottom of the sea, so what?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, this is absurd. And so I just think, Iran is going to come out of this in a stronger position in spite of they've suffered harm and punishment and, whatever else. But I think strategically, they're in a stronger position coming out of this. The Iranians are fighting us with $2,500 drones that we're shooting down with $2 million missiles, for goodness sake.
Shooting down $2,500 tin drones with $2 million platinum missiles. That is the definition of a strategic bear trap. and has costed the United States upwards of $2 billion a day in the Persian Gulf, burning through interceptor stockpiles that are supposed to be protecting the homeland from intercontinental ballistic missile threats. Historically, when a president launches an overseas military campaign, there's a predictable rally around the flag effect. The public falls in line, deferring to the so-called foreign policy elites. But financial strain on everyday Americans has fundamentally broken that deference. And here's Chris on why public sentiment has shifted completely away from Washington's war planners.
Part of the reason why foreign policy experts have sort of dismissed public sentiment is because, again, as the political scientists say, foreign policy is an elite-driven sport.
Yeah.
The American people, the average man and woman, they have their own things to worry about. They have a tendency to defer to elite expertise when it comes to matters of war and peace, when it comes to matters of foreign policy. And I understand that. That's fine. But we have witnessed with this war that deference to elite opinion has not happened. There is not the rally around the flag effect that you would typically see in a war like this. This war is shockingly unpopular, as it should be, frankly. Yeah. But that tells you something, right? That tells you that we are in a different place now than we were 25 years ago, when a lot of folks were willing to say, okay, Afghanistan, fine, we understand 9/11, Al-Qaeda. Oh, President Trump, President Bush, yeah, Iraq, 9/11, fine. No. That's not the world we live in anymore, right? That's that level of deference that people are willing to extend to elite experts, sort of saying, trust me on this one. Mm-hmm. No, that's gone.
That trust is gone. And because results speak for themselves. Yet instead of self-correcting, the current administration seems determined to double down on bullying tactics closer to home. Specifically, 90 miles off the coast of Florida, where a medieval economic siege is currently strangling Cuba, cutting off fuel, lightning, and electricity to millions of civilians. It's almost like they're doing everything except throwing the plague bodies by catapult over the castle walls. The administration's internal logic seems to be built on the recent intervention in Venezuela, which they view as a blueprint because it didn't cost American lives. But Chris issues a stark warning about the historical amnesia driving our policy towards Cuba and why the military tool is fundamentally the wrong instrument.
What does the Trump administration, how do they think this is going to play out? What is the scenario that this, imposing this suffering, what's it going to produce? Yeah. And I guess there's one of two things that they think might happen. One is that the Cuban people are suffering so much that they overthrow their system of government and call for the United States to replace that government in the hope that will relieve their pain, right? But we've tried this many times, and it doesn't have a great track record. We now know, even the strategic bombing that was done in Germany and even in Japan did not lead to those people rising up and overthrowing their system of government. It just didn't happen that way. That's not how it went down. The alternative scenario is sort of the reverse of that, which is the Cuban government in power says, we want to relieve the burdens on the people, and therefore we're going to step down voluntarily as opposed to being overthrown. But even there, what assurances is the United States prepared to extend to these individuals? What comfortable retirement are we offering them? We're not. I really hope, just as the president sort of misread the lessons of Venezuela as it applies to Iran, I really hope that President Trump isn't misreading the lessons of Venezuela as it applies to Cuba and saying, well, Cuba's different because it's close. Yeah. That's not. No.
If force, economic strangulation, and military coercion have a near zero track record of achieving lasting national security, what's the alternative? In Washington, diplomacy is often treated like a weak-kneed afterthought, something you only do after the bombs drop or as a handmaiden to military power. But as Chris and I discussed, our nation's history tells a completely different story. We used to achieve historic, monumental geopolitical victories precisely when our military was weak because we relied on funding and finding mutual benefit. We used to achieve historic, monumental geopolitical victories precisely when our military was weak because we relied on finding mutual benefit. I asked Chris for his parting thoughts on what the American people need to lean into right now to demand accountability from a derelict Congress that refuses to even vote on these wars.
Diplomacy is identifying common interests, finding areas of agreement and modes of cooperation. And I think there's a real challenge for Americans the joke is that in movies, right, the diplomats are the guys who come in after the war's over, and they're sort of the legalistic, sniveling, sign this piece of paper. Diplomacy is literally that. It's the guys who sort of put the papers away after defeat. Well, no, that's not what diplomacy is. But it makes for terrible movies, because diplomacy is when the war doesn't happen at all.
Yeah. Right.
And so what's the imagery around that? I genuinely believe, like, we in this country need to understand the history of what our diplomats used to do. We need to understand when we punched above our weight diplomatically, precisely because we were relatively weak militarily. And we were able to accomplish a lot without threatening people. And so this notion of diplomacy as merely a handmaiden to military force, that's just wrong. But do not succumb to cynicism and pessimism. There is a path forward. We have many strengths as a country, and frankly, we need to capitalize on those strengths. We need to use those strengths. We have a system of government that is accountable. It needs to be held accountable. We need to live within our means. This is basic principles of that apply to individuals as well as they do to states. So, having more debt than we have in, our debt to GDP ratio. What is it? 250 or something like that. This is obscene. And so, we need to live within our means. We need to prioritize. That's a perfectly reasonable expectation.
Diplomacy is when war doesn't happen at all. Living in a democratically elected republic means foreign policy cannot remain a spectator sport or an elite-driven game. The government acts in our name with our dollars and the lives of our nation's sons and daughters. If you see policies around the world carried out in your name that offend your basic sense of humanity or fiscal sanity, call your representatives. Demand that Congress asserts its constitutional duty and votes on these interventions. You could read more of Chris Preble's open source work on grand strategy at stimson.org and listen to his weekly deep dives on Net Assessment podcast. As always, you can follow us here on the Meidas Defense podcast, on the MeidasTouch network, or find my writing on Substack at Joe Plenzler. You can also follow us on Valor Media Network. Get involved, say something, and let's demand a foreign policy built on strategy rather than knee-jerk reactions. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
Want to stay plugged in? Become a subscriber to our Substack at MeidasPlus.com. You'll get daily recaps from Ron Filipkowski, ad-free episodes of our podcast, and more exclusive content only available at MeidasPlus.com.